Late September 1815 brought grey autumn rain to London, the kind that streaked the tall windows of Pembroke House and made the heavy burgundy drapes seem to swallow what little light remained in the afternoon sky. And it was in this dimness that Eleanor Whitmore sat in her usual corner of the drawing-room, her needle moving through fabric she did not own to mend a tear she had not made, wearing a faded lavender dress that had once belonged to her aunt, and now hung on her slighter frame like an apology for existing. She was 27 years old, and society had already written her epitaph: spinster, companion, invisible. Her aunt, Mrs. Harriet Pembroke, held court from the settee nearest the fire, her voice carrying the particular brightness of a woman who had received exactly the invitation she had spent 3 seasons pursuing. The cream envelope lay open on the side table like a trophy, its wax seal bearing the Ravenscroft crest, and Eleanor watched her aunt's visitors lean forward with the hungry attention such correspondence commanded. "I simply cannot imagine why the Duke has finally opened Ravenscroft Hall," Mrs. Pembroke declared, though the satisfaction in her tone suggested she imagined it quite clearly. A house party at this time of year, and such a select guest list. Her friends murmured their envy, their speculation, and Eleanor kept her eyes on her stitching while their words washed over her. "They say his grandmother is dying," offered Lady Whitfield, "and he must finally choose a bride. The Dowager Duchess will not rest until she sees him settled. Poor man, hunted by every mother in England, though I hear Lady Lydia Greville has all but claimed him." "She is his cousin, is she not? And so very beautiful." They discussed Lady Lydia's red-gold hair, her emerald wardrobe, her determined pursuit of the Duke of Ashworth, and Eleanor absorbed these details with the passive attention of one accustomed to being furniture. She had heard of the Duke, of course. Everyone had. Frederick Ravenscroft was known for his cold demeanor and cutting intelligence, a man who could silence a room with a glance, and who had refused every eligible woman presented to him for a decade. That he might finally be cornered into marriage seemed to delight the gossips enormously. "Eleanor," her aunt said suddenly, and Eleanor looked up to find herself remembered. "You will attend me at Ravenscroft Hall. I shall need someone to manage the tedious details." It was not a question, and Eleanor had not expected one. She inclined her head in the manner of one who had long ago surrendered the luxury of objection. "Yes, Aunt Harriet." She returned to her mending while her aunt's friends exchanged glances that dismissed her entirely, their conversation flowing around her absence as water flows around a stone. The rain continued against the windows, and Eleanor thought of nothing at all, which was safer than thinking of the week ahead. Another week of carrying shawls and fetching forgotten items and standing at the edges of rooms where no one would speak to her. She had perfected the art of expecting nothing, and nothing was precisely what she received. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. The rain had not ceased by the time Eleanor climbed the narrow stairs to her small room under the eaves, where the ceiling sloped so low she had learned years ago to duck her head near the window, and where the single candle she was permitted cast shadows that made the cramped space feel both smaller and somehow infinite in its loneliness. She removed the faded lavender dress with the careful movements of one who knew that carelessness with borrowed things brought consequences, hanging it on the hook behind the door, where it would wait for tomorrow's wearing and the day after that, an endless procession of the same fabric against the same skin in the same forgettable rooms. Her nightgown was her own, at least, worn soft from years of washing, but purchased with the small inheritance her mother had left her, the inheritance that had not been enough to serve as a dowry, but had allowed her these few private possessions that belonged to no one else. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed and listened to the rain against the roof just above her head, that intimate percussion that was her only company most evenings, and she allowed herself to feel what she never permitted during daylight hours, the weight of all she had lost, and worse, all she had never been allowed to want in the first place. From beneath her pillow she withdrew a worn volume of poetry, its spine cracked from countless readings, its pages soft as cloth from the oils of her fingers returning again and again to the same verses. She had discovered romantic poetry at 17, when she had still believed that passion and beauty and great consuming love might find her too, and though she knew better now, she could not relinquish the habit of these words that spoke of feeling more deeply than she was permitted to feel. Between the pages rested a pressed flower, a violet from her mother's garden, now brown and fragile. As old paper, the last living thing she had taken from that house before her father's debts had claimed it and cast her upon her aunt's reluctant charity. She held the book but did not open it, instead catching her reflection in the small mirror above the washstand, and she made herself look, truly look, at the face that had earned society's verdict of plain, features that assembled correctly but without distinction, brown hair that held no gold or copper lights, grey eyes that might have been called fine if anyone had ever looked into them long enough to notice. She was 27, and she understood with perfect clarity that this face had consigned her to invisibility, that no house party would change her circumstances, that she would carry shawls and fetch forgotten reticules until her aunt died, and some other relative was burdened with her keeping. She thought briefly of the Duke of Ashworth, that cold and hunted man the gossips had described, and she wondered what it felt like to be pursued rather than overlooked, then dismissed the thought as dangerous, and opened her book of poems to read herself toward sleep. Ravenscroft Hall rose from the October landscape like a monument to old power and older grief, its grey stone walls climbing toward a sky that had finally cleared after weeks of rain, though the pale afternoon light seemed uncertain of its welcome against those ancient facades where ivy clung in rust and bronze, the leaves just beginning their autumn surrender. Eleanor stepped down from her aunt's carriage and felt the cold air fill her lungs with the scent of dying leaves and wood smoke, and something else, something that whispered of grandeur beyond anything her modest life had prepared her to witness. And she made herself small in the way she had perfected over years of standing at the edges of rooms where she did not belong. The drive was filled with other carriages, finer than her aunt's, disgorging guests in silks and velvets, who greeted each other with the easy warmth of people accustomed to such gatherings, and Eleanor in her dove-grey travelling dress that had been mended twice at the hem moved among them like a shadow passing through sunlight. Her aunt had already swept ahead toward the entrance, leaving Eleanor to manage the small details of arrival that companions managed, and so she was standing alone near the fountain when she heard the whisper that was meant for other ears. Lady Beatrice Montague's voice carried the particular clarity of someone who did not care if she was overheard, or perhaps who hoped she would be. "Is that Mrs. Pembroke's creature?" she said to her companion, the spinster niece who trails behind her like a grey ghost. How charitable of the Duke to allow such a pitiful addition to his guest list. Eleanor kept her face still, as she had learned to keep it still, absorbing the words without flinching, filing them away in the place where she stored all such remarks, a place that had grown crowded over the years. She lifted her eyes to the house instead of to her tormentors, and found herself studying the windows of the upper floors, those tall rectangles of glass that reflected the golden afternoon light. And she did not know that behind one of those windows a man stood watching the arrivals with the expression of someone facing his own execution. Frederick Ravenscroft, Duke of Ashworth, observed the carriages below with the controlled tension of a man who had been hunted for a decade and knew the hounds were closing in, and when his eye caught the flash of red-gold hair emerging from an emerald-green travelling costume, his jaw tightened in a way that his closest friend, Lord Charles Sinclair, standing nearby, recognized as barely contained desperation. Lady Lydia had arrived, beautiful and certain, her gaze already lifting toward his window as though she could feel him watching, and Frederick stepped back into the shadows of his study rather than give her the satisfaction of seeing him there. His grandmother had sent word that morning that she wished to meet his intended bride, and he had no intended bride, and he was running out of time in ways that had nothing to do with marriage and everything to do with a dying woman's last wish. In the courtyard below, Eleanor Whitmore gathered her aunt's forgotten shawl and followed the other guests inside, and neither she nor the Duke noticed the other at all. The dining room at Ravenscroft Hall blazed with the light of 100 candles reflected in crystal and silver, and Eleanor sat at the far end of the long table where companions and poor relations were placed, near enough to be counted among the guests, but far enough to be forgotten by anyone who mattered. And she found this suited her perfectly because it allowed her to observe without being observed in return. She wore her best dress, a soft blue muslin that had been fashionable 3 years ago and was now merely acceptable, and she had arranged her brown hair with more care than usual, though no one at the glittering table would notice or care. From her position of invisibility, she watched the drama unfolding at the head of the table, where the Duke of Ashworth presided with the rigid control of a man holding himself together by will alone, his dark coat immaculate, his silver cravat pin catching the candlelight, his face a mask of ducal courtesy that Eleanor suspected cost him more than anyone knew. Lady Lydia Greville had been seated at his right hand, a placement she had surely manoeuvred, and her red-gold hair gleamed like copper beneath the chandeliers, while her emerald earrings caught the light each time she leaned toward him with some murmured intimacy. Her beautiful face arranged in an expression of devoted attention that Eleanor recognized immediately as performance. She watched Lady Lydia's gloved hand brush the Duke's sleeve, watched him shift almost imperceptibly away, watched the slight tightening of his jaw that no one else seemed to notice, and Eleanor felt something unexpected stir in her chest, something that might have been sympathy for this cold, proud man who was being hunted so openly in his own home. The meal progressed through endless courses while Eleanor ate without tasting and listened to the conversations around her without participating, and when a footman appeared at the Duke's elbow to deliver a whispered message, she saw his face change, saw something like anguish flash across those controlled features before he mastered it, and she understood without knowing how that the message concerned his grandmother, the Dowager Duchess who was said to be too ill to leave her chambers. When the ladies withdrew after dinner, and the gentlemen remained for their port, Eleanor did not follow her aunt and the other women to the drawing-room, where they would gossip and play cards, and wait for the men to rejoin them. Instead, she slipped away down a corridor she had noticed earlier, following the scent of leather and old paper until she found the library, that sanctuary of walnut paneling and dying firelight, where books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, and deep leather chairs promised solitude and peace. She chose a chair in the shadows near the cold window where the clear autumn night pressed against the glass, and she drew her worn volume of poetry from the pocket of her dress where she had hidden it, and she began to read by the fading glow of the fire, not knowing that within the hour she would no longer be invisible, that the door would open and everything would change. The door opened without warning, and Eleanor looked up from her book with the startled expression of someone caught in a place she did not belong, her heart seizing in her chest as she saw the Duke of Ashworth standing in the doorway, his tall figure silhouetted against the light from the corridor behind him, and she began to rise, an apology already forming on her lips, because of course she should not be here. Of course she should be in the drawing-room with the other ladies pretending to enjoy conversation. She was never invited to join. "Forgive me, Your Grace." she said. "I did not mean to intrude. I will go at once." But he raised a hand to stop her, and something in his face, some weariness that cracked the cold mask she had observed at dinner, made her pause with her book still clutched against her chest like a shield. "Please," he said, and his voice was rougher than she had expected, stripped of the formal polish he had worn at the table. "Do not leave on my account. I came here seeking escape from the very company you are fleeing to rejoin." He stepped into the library and closed the door behind him, and Eleanor found herself sinking back into her chair because her legs did not seem capable of carrying her anywhere, and she watched as he crossed to the fireplace and stood staring into the dying embers with the posture of a man carrying weights she could not see. He did not speak for a long moment, and she did not know if she should remain silent or excuse herself again. But then his eye fell on the book in her hands, and something shifted in his expression, something that might have been recognition or surprise. "You read Wordsworth?" he said, and it was not quite a question, but not quite a statement either, and Eleanor glanced down at her worn volume as though she had forgotten she held it. "I do," she said. "He has been a companion to me for many years," which was more honest than she had intended to be. And when she looked up again, she found the Duke watching her with an expression she could not decipher. "He is a companion to me as well," he said quietly. And then, as though the admission had cost him something, he moved to the chair across from hers and sat down without ceremony, without the formality that should have governed every interaction between a duke and a spinster companion of no consequence. She felt the strangeness of it acutely, this informality, this sitting in firelight with a man who should not even know her name. And when he asked what her name was, she told him, "Eleanor Whitmore," and added, "I am Mrs. Pembroke's niece and companion," expecting this information to end whatever strange interlude had begun. But instead he nodded slowly, and his dark eyes studied her face with an attention no one had paid her in years, and somewhere in the house a clock began to strike midnight, each chime falling into the silence between them like stones dropped into still water, and Eleanor understood without knowing how that this moment was a door, and she had already stepped through it. The morning came grey and cold, frost silvering the hedges and turning the lawns of Ravenscroft Hall into fields of pale crystal. And Eleanor walked alone through the garden because she could not bear to sit in the breakfast-room with the other guests, could not bear the prospect of her aunt's indifference, or Lady Beatrice's cutting whispers, or the sight of Lady Lydia leaning close to the Duke with her copper hair and her emerald earrings and her beautiful calculating smile. She had not slept well, her mind returning again and again to the library, to the firelight, to the way he had sat across from her and spoken to her as though she were a person worth speaking to. And she had told herself 100 times that it meant nothing, that he had been tired and seeking escape, and she had merely been convenient, that a man like the Duke of Ashworth did not notice women like Eleanor Whitmore, except by accident. And yet she could not stop the traitorous flutter in her chest when she remembered how he had looked at her, how he had said that Wordsworth was a companion to him as well, how the clock had struck midnight and neither of them had moved. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, her grey dress inadequate against the October chill, and she walked toward the old stone bench at the far end of the garden where the hedges formed a kind of alcove, a place where she might be alone with her foolish thoughts and her worn volume of poetry and the sharp, clean air that smelled of frost and dying leaves. She did not hear his footsteps on the gravel path until he was nearly upon her, and when she turned and saw Frederick Ravenscroft standing there in his formal coat, with shadows beneath his eyes that spoke of a sleepless night, her heart stopped and then started again with a painful lurch, and she rose from the bench because one did not remain seated when a duke approached. even a duke who had shared poetry with you in a darkened library. "Miss Whitmore," he said, and his voice was strange, tight with something she could not name. "I have been looking for you." She did not know what to say to this, could not imagine why the Duke of Ashworth would seek out his guest's invisible companion in a frozen garden at an hour when sensible people were eating breakfast and planning the day's entertainments. And so she said nothing, only stood with her breath making small clouds in the cold air, while he looked at her with an intensity that made her want to step backward. "I have a proposition for you," he said, and then, before she could respond, he told her, his words coming faster than she would have expected from such a controlled man, told her about his grandmother who was dying, who wished to see him engaged before she passed, told her about Lady Lydia, whose pursuit had become intolerable, told her that he needed someone to pretend to be his betrothed for the remaining week of the house party, and when Eleanor simply stared at him in stunned silence, he said the words that broke something open inside her. "I am asking you because you are invisible to everyone who would question it, and because last night in the library, you were the first person in longer than I can remember who spoke to me as though I were simply a man." Eleanor stood in the frozen garden with his words echoing in her mind, and she thought that this must be what it felt like to step off a cliff, that moment of suspension before the fall when the ground was no longer beneath your feet, and the air had not yet caught you. And she heard herself say in a voice that did not quite sound like her own, "You are asking me to lie to everyone, to your grandmother, to the guests, to pretend to be something I could never actually be." And he did not flinch from her words, but instead nodded slowly, his dark eyes holding hers with an honesty that should not have been possible from a man proposing such deception. "Yes," he said, "I am asking you to lie, but I am also promising you that when this week ends, I will ensure no harm comes to your reputation. I will say that we discovered ourselves incompatible, that the fault was mine, that you released me from the engagement with grace and dignity, and no one will speak ill of you because no one speaks ill of a woman a duke has publicly cherished." She wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it, at the idea that anyone would believe the cold Duke of Ashworth had chosen plain Eleanor Whitmore over beautiful Lady Lydia. But something in his face stopped her, something raw and desperate beneath the careful composure, and she found herself asking, "What would be required of me?" and was surprised to hear the question emerge as though she were actually considering this madness. He told her then, speaking quickly as though afraid she would flee if he paused, told her about the public performance they would need to maintain, the small gestures of affection, the appearance at his grandmother's bedside, the deflection of Lady Lydia's advances. And when he finished, she was silent for a long moment, her breath making clouds in the cold air, while she turned the proposition over in her mind like a stone she had found on a beach, examining it from every angle. "I have one condition," she said finally, and he straightened almost imperceptibly, waiting. "If we are to do this," she continued, "then within the pretense you must be honest with me. You must not perform for me in private. I will play your devoted betrothed before the world, but when we are alone, I require the truth, whatever that truth may be." He studied her face with an expression she could not read, and then, slowly, deliberately, he extended his gloved hand toward her, and Eleanor looked at it for a moment before she realized with a small jolt of embarrassment that she had left her gloves inside, that her hand was bare when she reached out to take his, and the cold leather of his glove against her chilled fingers felt like a seal on something momentous, something that could not be undone. "Then we have an agreement, Miss Whitmore," he said, and she thought she saw something flicker in his eyes, something that might have been relief, or might have been something else entirely. "Eleanor," she corrected before she could stop herself, If I am to be your betrothed, you should call me Eleanor." A single red leaf detached itself from the hedge above them, and drifted down between their joined hands, and when Frederick smiled, it was the first genuine smile she had seen from him, small and unexpected, and transforming his stern face into something almost gentle. "Eleanor," he repeated, and in the window of the house behind them, Lady Lydia Greville watched with narrowed eyes as the Duke of Ashworth raised his false betrothed's bare hand to his lips. The drawing-room of Ravenscroft Hall was filled with afternoon light that streamed through the tall windows and fell upon the assembled guests like a spotlight upon a stage, and Eleanor stood beside Frederick with his grandmother's ring heavy on her finger, and her heart beating so loudly she was certain everyone in the room could hear it, could see the fraud she was, could smell the desperation beneath her composure. And yet when Frederick took her hand and raised it slightly as he addressed the room, his grip was steady and warm, and somehow that steadiness flowed into her like water into parched earth. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said in a voice that carried without effort, "I have the great pleasure of announcing my engagement to Miss Eleanor Whitmore." And the silence that followed was so complete that Eleanor could hear the fire crackling in the grate, could hear the sharp intake of breath from Lady Lydia, who stood near the window in her emerald earrings, with her face gone white as bone, could hear her Aunt Harriet make a sound that might have been a gasp, or might have been a whimper of disbelief. The whispers began almost immediately, a tide of murmurs that washed through the room like poison through water, and Eleanor caught fragments of them. Her of all people and plain little thing, and how extraordinary, and surely there must be some mistake. But Frederick's hand tightened on hers, and when she glanced up at him, his face was serene, almost tender, and he was looking at her as though she were the only person in the room worth looking at. Lady Beatrice Montague leaned toward Mrs. Pemberton with her fan raised to hide her lips, and Eleanor did not need to hear the words to know their cruelty. But then Frederick was leading her forward, introducing her to Lord Charles Sinclair, who bowed with perfect courtesy and only the slightest flicker of surprise in his kind eyes, and Eleanor found herself performing a role she had never rehearsed with a grace she had not known she possessed. Lady Lydia approached with a smile that did not reach her eyes, her voice honey over broken glass as she said, "What a delightful surprise, cousin. We had no idea you were even acquainted with Mrs. Pembroke's companion." And Frederick replied smoothly, "Some connections are too precious to parade before the world until they are certain." And Eleanor felt something shift in her chest at the word precious, even knowing it was performance, even knowing none of this was real. Her Aunt Harriet appeared at her elbow with an expression Eleanor had never seen before. Something almost like respect, or perhaps merely calculation. And she said, "My dear Eleanor, you sly creature, you never breathed a word." And Eleanor murmured something appropriate while the ring caught the light, and the eyes of every guest in the room followed its gleam. She had spent so many years being invisible, being overlooked, being the shadow in the corner of every room she entered, and now, suddenly, she was seen. She was the center of attention. She was the woman the Duke of Ashworth had chosen, and even though she knew it was pretense, even though she knew the whispers were not admiration, but shock, something long frozen inside her began to thaw, something that remembered what it felt like to matter. The evening had grown quiet by the time Frederick led Eleanor through the shadowed corridors of the East Wing, away from the drawing-room where the other guests still lingered over cards and gossip, and she could feel the change in him, the tension that had replaced the smooth performance of the afternoon, and she understood without being told that they were going to see his grandmother, that this was the true purpose of their deception, the heart of everything he had asked of her. The dowager's chambers were warm with candlelight and heavy with the scent of lavender and something else beneath it, something that spoke of medicine and mortality, and Eleanor felt her throat tighten as Frederick paused at the door with his hand on the frame, his face in that moment stripped of all its careful composure, showing her the frightened grandson beneath the Duke. "She is everything to me," he said quietly, the words meant only for Eleanor. "She raised me when my parents could not be bothered. She taught me that coldness was not strength, and I have failed her by not giving her this one thing she wanted, a promise that I would not be alone." Eleanor touched his arm without thinking, a gesture that was not part of any performance, and then they entered together, and she saw the woman who had shaped him, small and fragile against the pillows, but with eyes that were sharp as winter stars, eyes that fixed upon Eleanor with an intelligence that seemed to pierce through every layer of pretense to the uncertain heart beneath. "So this is she?" the dowager said, her voice thin but steady. "Come closer, child. Let me see what my grandson has chosen." Eleanor approached the bed, and when the old woman reached for her hand, she gave it willingly. Feeling the papery skin and the surprising strength in those aged fingers, feeling too the weight of the ring that had once belonged to this woman, now pressing between their joined palms. The dowager studied her for a long moment, cataloguing her plain features and her nervous eyes, and whatever else she found written there, and then she smiled, a smile that transformed her face and showed Eleanor the beauty she must once have possessed. "You are not what I expected," the dowager said softly. "You are not the sort of woman my grandson usually surrounds himself with, all beauty and no substance." And Eleanor did not know how to respond, did not know if she was being praised or condemned, but she found herself saying simply, "I am only myself. Your Grace, I have nothing else to offer." The old woman laughed, a sound like dry leaves rustling, and she looked past Eleanor to where Frederick stood by the door, his face unreadable in the candlelight. "He chose you for a reason he does not yet understand," the dowager said, her eyes returning to Eleanor with something that might have been kindness or might have been warning. "But you understand, do you not? You see it, even if he cannot." Eleanor felt the words settle into her chest like stones, and when she finally dared to look back at Frederick, she found him watching her with an expression she had never seen before, something raw and wondering, as though he were seeing her for the first time. The small stone church on the Ravenscroft estate stood ancient and weathered beneath the pale autumn sky, and Eleanor sat beside Frederick in the family pew with the eyes of every guest upon them, feeling the warmth of his shoulder against hers and the weight of the congregation's scrutiny pressing down like a physical force, and she tried to focus on the vicar's words about grace and redemption, but her mind kept returning to the way Frederick had appeared at her door that morning, offering his arm with a smile that seemed less practiced than before, something softer in his eyes that made her breath catch in a way she could not afford. Lady Lydia sat 3 rows back with her emerald earrings catching the light through the stained glass windows, her gaze fixed on Eleanor's back like a blade between the shoulder blades. And when the service ended, and they filed out into the crisp golden morning, Eleanor felt the other woman intercept her path with the precision of a hawk, her voice carrying just enough for nearby guests to hear as she said, "How fortunate you are, Miss Whitmore, to have caught a duke's eye when so many worthier candidates have failed. One wonders what particular talents a companion might possess to achieve such a miracle." Eleanor felt the words land like stones, but she did not flinch, did not look away. Instead, she smiled with a calm she did not feel, and replied, "Perhaps His Grace simply values substance over spectacle. Lady Lydia, I understand the distinction can be confusing for some," and she saw the flash of fury in those beautiful green eyes before Frederick appeared at her side, his hand settling at the small of her back with a possessive warmth that sent heat rushing through her entire body. The afternoon stretched before them, golden and warm, an unexpected gift of October sunshine. And Frederick suggested a walk through the autumn woods with an ease that felt nothing like obligation, and Eleanor found herself agreeing before she could remind herself of all the reasons she should maintain distance, should protect herself, should remember this was temporary. They walked through paths carpeted with fallen leaves, red and gold and amber crunching beneath their feet, and Frederick offered his arm, and she took it. And they talked, truly talked, not the careful performance of the drawing-room, but something real and raw and honest. She told him about her mother, dead these 8 years, about the consumption that had stolen her slowly, about the pressed flower she still kept from her mother's garden because it was all she had left, about the suitors who had vanished when her small dowry proved insufficient and her face proved unremarkable, about the slow resignation to invisibility that had become her armor and her prison. He told her about his father's coldness, about being sent away at 7 to learn to be a duke rather than a son, about his grandmother being the only one who had ever held him when he cried, about the loneliness of being surrounded by people who wanted his title rather than him. They paused at a small stone folly overlooking a pond scattered with floating leaves, and Frederick turned to her with an expression she could not read, and he said quietly, "I find myself forgetting this is pretense when I am with you," and Eleanor felt her heart crack open with terrified hope. The morning of the 4th day dawned grey and uncertain, matching the turmoil that Eleanor felt stirring beneath her carefully composed exterior as she dressed in the soft rose gown that had appeared in her wardrobe without explanation, a gift she knew must have come from Frederick, though neither of them had spoken of it, and she caught her reflection in the mirror and saw a woman she barely recognized, someone who looked almost pretty in the gentle color, someone who looked almost hopeful, and that terrified her more than any cruelty Lady Lydia could devour. She found herself looking for him in every room she entered, listening for his voice in every corridor, and when she did not find him, she felt his absence like a missing limb, and she knew with growing certainty that she was in terrible danger, that she was falling in love with a man who had asked her to pretend, and she could not remember any more where the pretense ended and her foolish heart began. It was in the gallery that she heard them, Lady Lydia and Lady Beatrice speaking in voices just loud enough to carry, and she pressed herself against the wall as Lady Lydia said, "Of course she trapped him somehow, a plain, desperate spinster. Like that does not attract a duke without some scheme, fortune-hunting at its most pathetic." And Lady Beatrice replied, "Perhaps she is not so plain as we thought. Perhaps she has hidden talents," and their laughter was sharp as broken glass. Eleanor felt the words sink into the old wounds, the familiar pain of being seen as less than, as nothing, and she turned to flee to the library, their private space, needing to be alone, needing to remember how to breathe through the shame. But Lord Charles Sinclair intercepted her in the corridor, his kind eyes seeing too much as he said quietly, "Miss Whitmore, I have known Frederick since we were boys, and I have never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you. Whatever this began as, it is not pretense now," and Eleanor could not respond, could not trust her voice, could only stare at him until footsteps announced Frederick's arrival, and she saw his face change as he took in her expression. "What happened?" he demanded, his voice sharp with concern, and when she could not answer, he turned to Lord Charles, who said only, "Lady Lydia," and that was enough. Frederick found them still in the morning-room, surrounded by guests, and Eleanor watched from the doorway, as he approached Lady Lydia with cold fury burning in his eyes. And he said in a voice that carried to every corner, "I understand you have been spreading lies about my future wife. Let me be clear. Miss Whitmore is the most genuine person in this house. She has more worth in her smallest gesture than you possess in your entire scheming soul." and if I hear one more word spoken against her, I will ensure society knows exactly what kind of woman you truly are." The silence that followed was absolute, and Eleanor felt tears threatening as Frederick turned and walked to her and took her hand, his grip firm and warm and real, and she saw in his eyes something that looked nothing like pretense, something that looked terrifyingly like love. The evening gathered soft and golden around Ravenscroft Hall as the guests assembled for dinner, and Eleanor descended the staircase in the rose gown that seemed to have been made for her, feeling Frederick's gaze find her before she reached the bottom step, and the way he looked at her stole her breath, not the careful performance of previous days, but something raw and wondering and real, as if he were seeing her for the first time and could not understand how he had ever looked elsewhere. He met her at the foot of the stairs and offered his arm with a formality that belied the tremor she felt in his fingers, and he said quietly, so only she could hear, "You are beautiful tonight, Eleanor." And she heard no pretense in his voice, only truth, and she did not know how to answer, so she simply took his arm and let him lead her into the dining room, where every face turned toward them, and she saw the shift in the gathered guests, the grudging reassessment, the dawning realization that perhaps the Duke had not made such a strange choice after all. Dinner passed in a warm blur of candlelight and conversation, and Eleanor found herself laughing at something Lord Charles said, found herself speaking without fear of judgment, found herself feeling beautiful in a way she had never felt before, not because of the gown or the ring on her finger, but because of the way Frederick watched her across the table, as if she were the only person in the room worth seeing. Afterward, the party moved to the music room, where Lady Beatrice played tolerably, and Lady Lydia played brilliantly, her fingers punishing the keys with a precision meant to remind everyone of her accomplishments, and when she finished, she turned to Eleanor with poison sweetness and said, "Surely Miss Whitmore will favor us with a song." And Eleanor felt the trap closing around her. But Frederick rose before she could refuse, crossing the room to stand beside her, and he said, "Miss Whitmore does not perform for entertainment. She reserves her talents for those who deserve them." And then he turned to her with a question in his eyes that had nothing to do with music. The guests dispersed slowly, and Frederick drew her into the small sitting room adjoining the music room, and in the firelight his face was all shadows and longing as he said, "I find I cannot remember what I intended this to be. I only know what it has become." Eleanor felt tears threatening, felt hope and terror warring in her chest, and she whispered, "This was supposed to be pretense," and he stepped closer. Close enough that she could see the rapid pulse at his throat, and he said, "I stopped pretending the moment you took my hand in the garden. I simply did not have the courage to tell you." The fire crackled in the silence between them, and Eleanor looked into his eyes and saw everything she had never dared hope for, and she said with a voice that shook, "I am afraid to believe you." And he reached up and touched her face with infinite gentleness and said, "Then let me spend every day proving it until you do." The night deepened around them in the small sitting room, the fire casting dancing shadows across Frederick's face as he stood so close that Eleanor could count the threads of silver in his cravat, could see the way his breath came uneven, could feel the warmth of his hand still cradling her cheek, and she thought her heart might shatter from the weight of what was happening, from the impossibility of a duke looking at a plain spinster companion as though she were the answer to every question he had ever asked. He did not move to kiss her, though she could see the wanting in his eyes, and she understood somehow that he was giving her the choice, refusing to take what she did not freely offer, and that restraint undid her more completely than any passionate gesture could have done, because it spoke of respect, of care, of a man who valued her consent above his own desire. "I need you to understand something," he said quietly, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone with devastating gentleness. when I asked you to pretend, I thought I knew what I was doing. I thought I could maintain control. I have controlled everything in my life since I was 18 and inherited a title I never wanted. But you, Eleanor, you have undone every defense I ever built, and I find I do not want to rebuild them." She felt tears slip down her cheeks, felt them catch against his fingers, and she whispered, "I am nobody, Frederick. I am a companion, a spinster. I have nothing to offer a duke." And he shook his head with something like frustration and said, "You are the only person who has ever seen me, not the title, not the fortune, not the duty, just the man who reads poetry alone in libraries and does not know how to be anything other than told because warmth was beaten out of him by expectation and obligation." The fire crackled and popped, and somewhere in the house a clock chimed the late hour. And Eleanor looked at this man who had everything the world valued and saw the loneliness that mirrored her own, the isolation that wealth and status could not cure, and she made a decision that terrified her and exhilarated her in equal measure. She reached up and covered his hand with her own, pressing his palm more firmly against her cheek, and she said, "I believe you," and the words cost her everything, every wall she had built, every protection she had constructed against hope, and she saw his eyes close briefly, as though the relief was almost pain. When he opened them again, they were bright with emotion, and he said, "Tomorrow I will speak to your aunt. I will make this real, if you will have me, not as pretense, not as arrangement, but as the man who loves you." And Eleanor heard herself laugh through her tears, heard herself say, "I will have you, Frederick. I think I have been waiting my entire life for someone to ask." The morning light filtered through Eleanor's window on Tuesday, day 5, and she woke with the memory of his hand against her cheek, his voice saying words she had never dared imagine hearing, and for a long moment she lay still beneath the counterpane, wondering if she had dreamed it all, if the exhaustion and emotion of the past days had conjured a fantasy too beautiful to be real. But then she felt the weight of the grandmother's ring still on her finger and remembered that he had asked her to keep wearing it, that he had said, "Tomorrow I will speak to your aunt," and her heart began to race with something that was equal parts terror and joy. She dressed carefully, choosing the rose gown again because it was the one he had given her, the one she had been wearing when everything changed, and when she descended to the breakfast room she found Frederick already there, standing by the window with Lord Charles, and the way his face transformed when he saw her told her that last night had been no dream, that this man who could have had anyone in England had chosen her, plain Eleanor Whitmore, who had spent 27 years believing herself unworthy of love. He crossed the room to her without hesitation, taking her hand and pressing it to his lips in full view of Lady Beatrice and 3 other guests who had risen early, and he said good morning in a voice that held such warmth that Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes, felt the reality of this impossible situation settle into her bones like sunlight after a long winter. Lady Lydia was conspicuously absent from breakfast, and Eleanor learned from whispered conversation that she had taken to her room with a headache, though everyone knew the true cause of her indisposition, and Eleanor found she could not summon any pleasure in her rival's defeat, only a strange compassion for a woman who had pursued a man incapable of loving her. After breakfast, Frederick drew her aside and said, "I have sent word to your aunt requesting a private audience this afternoon," and Eleanor felt panic flutter in her chest because Aunt Harriet was ambitious and unpredictable, and Eleanor could not guess how she would respond to a duke asking formal permission to court her unwanted niece. The morning passed in a haze of anticipation, and Eleanor found herself in the library again, the room that had become theirs, and Frederick found her there as she knew he would. And they sat together in the leather chairs by the cold fireplace and talked about everything and nothing, about poetry and philosophy and the futures they had imagined for themselves before fate had intervened. He told her about the estate he loved, about the tenant families he knew by name, about his hopes for agricultural improvements and schools for the village children. And she saw the man beneath the title, the man his grandmother had always believed in. And she thought her heart might burst from the fullness of loving him and being loved in return after so many years of emptiness. The afternoon light slanted through the tall windows of Aunt Harriet's private sitting room as Eleanor sat with her hands folded in her lap, watching Frederick pace before the fireplace with attention she had never seen in him, and she understood that this conversation mattered to him in ways that surprised her, that seeking her aunt's blessing was not mere formality, but something he genuinely wanted, something that spoke to his respect for the conventions that had shaped Eleanor's life, even as he prepared to upend them entirely. Aunt Harriet sat in her favorite chair, her expression cycling through astonishment and calculation, and something that might have been grudging reassessment. And when Frederick finally stopped pacing and said, "Mrs. Pembroke, I am here to formally request permission to court your niece with the intention of marriage," the silence that followed seemed to stretch into eternity, and Eleanor felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she waited for her aunt to laugh, to dismiss the notion, to reveal the cruelty that had defined their relationship for so many years. But Aunt Harriet did none of those things. Instead, she looked at Eleanor with an expression Eleanor had never seen before, something almost like seeing her for the first time, and she said, "Your Grace." I confess myself astonished. Eleanor has been with me for 7 years, and I never imagined. She trailed off, and Frederick said with quiet steel, "Perhaps you never looked." And Eleanor felt tears threaten at the simple defense, at the way he stood between her and a lifetime of dismissal with nothing but words and his unwavering presence. The negotiation that followed was surreal, Aunt Harriet asking practical questions about settlements and announcements, while Eleanor sat in stunned silence, watching her future reshape itself in the space of an afternoon, and when Frederick mentioned that Eleanor would, of course, have her own income, her own autonomy, her own life beyond being merely his wife, Aunt Harriet's eyebrows rose in surprise that slowly transformed into something like respect. "He is not what I expected," Aunt Harriet said later when Frederick had departed to check on his grandmother, leaving Eleanor alone with the woman who had defined her existence for nearly a decade. And Eleanor heard herself reply, "He is not what anyone expected, least of all me." The evening brought news that the Dowager Duchess wished to see Eleanor again, and she climbed the stairs to those candle-lit chambers with Frederick beside her, his hand warm at the small of her back. And when they entered, the old woman was propped against her pillows with her eyes bright and knowing. "You told him yes?" the Dowager said. And it was not a question, and Eleanor nodded and said, "I told him yes." And the Dowager smiled with a satisfaction that seemed to ease something in her frail frame. "He will be happy now," she said, looking at her grandson with a love that transcended decades of duty and distance. "I can go peacefully knowing he will be happy." And Frederick made a sound of protest, but his grandmother raised one thin hand to silence him. "Let an old woman have her dramatic moment," she said with dry humor that reminded Eleanor so forcefully of Frederick that she nearly laughed. And in that moment, she understood where he had learned to hide his heart behind wit. The days that followed moved with a strange, dreamlike quality, as if time itself had recognized that something precious was unfolding and had chosen to slow its relentless march. And Eleanor found herself suspended between the life she had known and the life that now stretched before her, like an uncharted country full of promise and terror in equal measure. Wednesday morning brought a subtle shift in the atmosphere of Ravenscroft Hall, as guests who had whispered behind their fans now approached Eleanor with tentative warmth, their curiosity overcoming their skepticism, and Lady Beatrice Montague herself sought Eleanor out in the breakfast room to offer congratulations that seemed, if not entirely sincere, at least no longer dripping with malice. The transformation in how others saw her was disorienting. This sudden visibility after years of cultivated invisibility, and Eleanor caught herself wondering which version of herself was real. The shadow who had drifted through her aunt's drawing room, or the woman who now sat at the Duke of Ashworth's right hand with his grandmother's ring gleaming on her finger. Frederick remained attentive in ways that continued to surprise her, appearing at her elbow when conversations grew tedious, steering her away from Lady Lydia's increasingly desperate attempts at confrontation, and once, when they found themselves alone in the corridor between the music room and the library, he had simply stood with her in comfortable silence, as if her presence was enough, as if he required nothing from her but the fact of her existence beside him. That afternoon, Lord Charles Sinclair cornered Eleanor in the garden, his expression thoughtful as he said, "I have known Frederick for 15 years, and I have never seen him like this." And when Eleanor asked what he meant, Charles smiled and replied, "He laughs now, actually laughs, and he looks at you as if you hold the answer to a question he did not know he was asking." The words settled into Eleanor's heart like seeds finding fertile soil, and she carried them with her through the remainder of the day, turning them over in her mind as she dressed for dinner, as she descended the stairs to find Frederick waiting at the bottom with his hand extended, as she sat beside him at the long table and felt the brush of his fingers against hers beneath the tablecloth. The Dowager Duchess had rallied slightly, well enough to send word that she wished to dine with the family on Thursday, and the household buzzed with preparations for what everyone understood might be one of her final appearances among them, and Eleanor felt the weight of that knowledge pressing against her chest, the awareness that joy and grief were so often intertwined, that her happiness was blooming in the shadow of approaching loss. That night she dreamed of her mother's garden, of flowers pressing between the pages of books, of a voice she barely remembered saying, "You will find your place in this world, my darling." And she woke with tears on her cheeks, and the dawn light creeping through her window like a benediction, like a promise that even the longest winters eventually yield to spring. Thursday dawned grey and cold, the autumn light filtering weakly through Eleanor's window as she dressed with trembling fingers, knowing that today the Dowager Duchess would descend to dine with the family for what everyone understood might be the last time. And the weight of that knowledge pressed against her chest as she smoothed the soft rose gown that Frederick had arranged for her, a colour she never would have chosen for herself, but which seemed to transform her reflection into someone she barely recognized, someone who might actually belong in the life that was unfolding before her. The morning passed in a blur of preparations, servants moving through the halls with quiet urgency, the household holding its collective breath as the hour of the dinner approached, and Eleanor found herself standing at the window of the small sitting room she had claimed as her own, watching the gardens below where frost still clung to the hedges despite the advancing day, when Frederick appeared beside her with such calm and grace that she startled at his sudden presence. "You are thinking too loudly," he said with that dry humour she had come to treasure, and she turned to find him watching her with an expression that made her heart stutter, an expression that held none of the careful distance of their early acquaintance, but instead seemed to offer her something precious and unguarded. "I am thinking about your grandmother," Eleanor admitted, "about what it means to her to come downstairs today." And Frederick nodded slowly, his jaw tightening in that way she now recognized as suppressed emotion, as the walls he had built around himself straining against the force of what he felt. "She wanted to see us together," he said quietly. "She wanted to see that I will not be alone after she is gone." And Eleanor heard in his voice the echo of a lonely boy who had grown into an isolated man, a man who had learned to expect nothing from the world and had received exactly that until a spinster companion had stumbled into his library on a cold autumn night. The dinner itself was a strange and beautiful thing, the Dowager Duchess presiding over the table from her chair at its head, her frail body wrapped in velvet and diamonds, her eyes sharp and knowing as they moved from face to face, lingering longest on Eleanor and Frederick, where they sat side by side. Lady Lydia had been placed at the far end of the table, her beautiful face rigid with barely concealed fury, her emerald earrings catching the candlelight as she picked at her food with mechanical precision, and Eleanor felt a moment of something almost like pity for a woman whose entire existence had been built around a future that would never come to pass. When the Dowager raised her glass and said in a voice that carried, despite its weakness, "To my grandson and his bride, to the future of this house," Eleanor felt tears threatening, and Frederick's hand found hers beneath the table, his fingers intertwining with hers in a grip that spoke of gratitude and tenderness, and something deeper still, something that had nothing to do with pretense and everything to do with the truth they had discovered in the space between performance and reality, in the quiet moments when they had simply been themselves. After the dinner ended and the guests dispersed into smaller groups throughout the house, Frederick guided Eleanor toward the music room, where candles flickered in silver sconces, and the pianoforte stood waiting in the corner like a silent witness to the evening's unfolding intimacy. And when Lady Beatrice suggested that Miss Whitmore might favor them with a song, Eleanor felt the old familiar dread rising in her throat, the certainty that she would fail, that her voice would crack or her fingers would stumble on the keys. But then Frederick's hand found the small of her back, warm and steady through the thin fabric of her rose gown, and he said in a voice that carried just far enough for others to hear, "My betrothed plays beautifully, but only for audiences who deserve such a gift," and the implication was clear enough that Lady Beatrice flushed and retreated to examine a painting on the far wall with sudden intense interest. Later, when the room had emptied, and only the two of them remained in the golden glow of dying candles, Eleanor sat at the pianoforte and let her fingers drift across the keys, playing softly. A melody her mother had taught her in another lifetime, and Frederick stood behind her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, close enough that when he spoke his breath stirred the loose strands of hair at her temple. "You play like someone who learned for joy rather than accomplishment," he said quietly, and Eleanor's fingers faltered for just a moment before finding their rhythm again, and she replied without turning, "My mother believed music should be felt rather than performed," and the silence that followed held something fragile and precious, something that had nothing to do with pretense and everything to do with two people who had spent their lives building walls, now finding those walls crumbling in the presence of each other. When she finally turned on the bench to face him, Frederick was looking at her with an expression she could not quite name, something between wonder and fear, and he said, "Eleanor," and then stopped, and the sound of her name in his voice, just her name with no title and no formality, broke something open inside her chest. "The week is half gone," she whispered, and the words hung between them like a question neither of them was ready to answer, and Frederick reached out to touch her face, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw with such gentleness that she felt tears threatening behind her eyes, and he said, I know," and his voice was rough with something that sounded like grief for an ending that had not yet arrived. They stood there in the dying candlelight, neither moving closer nor pulling away, suspended in a moment that felt like the edge of a cliff, and Eleanor thought of all the years she had spent invisible, all the years she had accepted that love was not meant for women like her, and she wondered how she would survive returning to that grey existence after knowing what it felt like to be seen, to be wanted, to be held in someone's gaze as if she were precious beyond measure. Tuesday arrived with a cruel wind that stripped the last golden leaves from the trees beyond Eleanor's window, and she woke with the weight of knowledge pressing against her chest, the awareness that only 2 days remained before this impossible dream would dissolve into memory, and she would return to the grey existence that had defined her life before Frederick Ravenscroft had looked at her and seen something worth seeing. And she lay for a long moment watching the pale morning light creep across the ceiling, letting herself feel the full measure of what she stood to lose, the conversations that wandered from poetry to philosophy to the small absurdities of daily life, the way his rare laughter transformed his stern features into something approaching boyish delight, the warmth of his hand finding hers beneath tables and in darkened corridors, as if touch had become a language they spoke fluently without ever having studied its grammar. When she finally rose and dressed, choosing the rose gown again because she had seen how his eyes softened when she wore it, she found a note slipped beneath her door in handwriting she now recognized as surely as her own, asking her to meet him in the library before breakfast, and her heart stuttered with a mixture of hope and dread as she made her way through the quiet corridors of Ravenscroft Hall, past servants who no longer looked through her but offered small smiles of acknowledgement, past the portrait gallery where generations of Ravenscrofts watched her with painted eyes that seemed to judge her worthiness for the family she would never truly join. Frederick was waiting by the window when she entered, silhouetted against the grey morning light, and when he turned to face her, she saw something in his expression that made her breath catch, a vulnerability she had glimpsed only in fragments now laid bare across his aristocratic features, and he said her name in that way he had begun to say it, just Eleanor, with no title and no formality, as if the word itself were precious. "I have been awake all night," he said, and she could see the evidence of it in the shadows beneath his eyes and the slight disarray of his usually immaculate cravat, and she wanted to cross the space between them and smooth the worried lines from his forehead, but she remained rooted to the spot, afraid that any movement would shatter whatever was about to happen. "The arrangement," he continued, his voice rough with something that sounded almost like pain. "It was meant to be a pretense." And Eleanor felt her heart begin to crack along fault lines she had not known existed, preparing herself for the gentle dismissal she had always known would come, the kind explanation that the week had been pleasant, but that they both understood it could never be real. But then he took a step toward her, and another, until he stood close enough that she could see the rapid pulse beating at his throat. And he said, "I find I can no longer pretend," and the words hung between them like a question and an answer all at once, and Eleanor understood with sudden devastating clarity that she stood at a crossroads where everything she had believed about herself and her place in the world was about to change forever. "What do you mean?" she whispered, though her heart already knew, already understood what he was trying to say, and Frederick closed the remaining distance between them until they stood so near that she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, could count the individual threads of silver in his dishevelled cravat, could feel the warmth radiating from him like a promise, and he lifted his hands to cup her face with a tenderness that made her tremble, and he said, "I mean that somewhere between the library and the garden and the music room and every moment in between, I stopped pretending. Eleanor, I stopped performing," and the words came faster now, as if a dam had broken inside him, and everything he had held back was rushing forth in an unstoppable flood. "I told myself it was gratitude," he continued. "I told myself it was admiration for your intelligence and your wit and the way you see the world so clearly while remaining so gentle in your observations. I told myself it was simply the relief of having someone see me as something other than a title and a fortune. But I was lying, Eleanor. I was lying to myself, because the truth is that I have fallen in love with you, and the word love hung in the air between them like something sacred and terrifying. And Eleanor felt the tears she had been holding back finally spill over, tracing hot paths down her cheeks where his thumbs caught them with infinite gentleness, and she thought of all the years she had spent believing she was unworthy of such words, all the mornings she had looked in her mirror and catalogued her plainness, all the evenings she had retreated to her small room to read poetry about passions she believed she would never experience. And here was this man, this Duke, this impossible man with his cold reputation and his warm hands and his eyes that saw her, truly saw her, telling her that he loved her, and she wanted to believe him so desperately that it felt like a physical ache in her chest. But the old voices whispered their familiar warnings, reminding her that she was 27 and plain and poor, reminding her that dukes did not fall in love with companions, reminding her that this was surely still part of some elaborate performance she did not understand, and Frederick must have seen the doubt flickering across her features, because his expression shifted to something raw and open as he said, "I know what you are thinking. I know you are wondering how this could possibly be real, how I could want you when I could have anyone, when society would expect me to choose someone beautiful and wealthy and young." And Eleanor flinched at the words, even though they were her own thoughts spoken aloud. But Frederick held her steady and continued with fierce intensity. "But those women are not you, Eleanor. They do not make me laugh. They do not challenge my assumptions. They do not sit with my dying grandmother and speak to her with such genuine compassion that she told me afterward that I had finally done something right. They do not look at me as if I am simply a man rather than a prize to be won. And you, Eleanor Whitmore, you are the only woman who has ever made me want to be worthy of being loved in return."